The story started before anyone believed them. A man who could bend iron bars with his bare hands. A shadow that moved through forests without leaving tracks. A giant who vanished into thin air while 50 men watched. They said he lifted a fully loaded wagon over his head to clear a path for children. They said he broke through chains that had held for 20 years. They said he was 7 feet of walking legend, and no one could catch him. His name was Caleb Thornton, but the bounty hunters who spent a year chasing him across Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana knew him only as the 7-foot giant, and every failed attempt to capture him added another layer to a legend that would haunt slave catchers for decades. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Blackwood plantation sat on 400 acres of Kentucky soil, and on a sweltering August morning in 1853, Overseer Marcus Brennan decided that Caleb Thornton had taken his last break without permission. The other slaves working the tobacco fields had learned to recognize the signs, the way Brennan's jaw tightened, the deliberate way he coiled his whip, the particular gleam in his eyes that meant someone was about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Caleb had been at Blackwood for 8 years, purchased from a failed plantation in Virginia when he was 16 years old, and in those 8 years he had grown from an unusually tall young man into something that made visitors stop and stare. At 7 feet and 2 inches, with shoulders that seemed carved from oak and hands that could palm a man's head like a child holds an apple, Caleb Thornton was the most valuable piece of property William Blackwood owned, worth at least $1,500 by the most conservative estimates. He could do the work of 3 men in the fields, could lift loads that required teams of horses, and had never once raised his voice in complaint or defiance. That morning, Caleb had paused to help an elderly slave named Moses who had collapsed from heat exhaustion, carrying the old man to shade and giving him water from his own ration. Brennan had watched this act of compassion with the cold calculation of a man who viewed kindness as weakness and weakness as something to be beaten out of anyone under his authority. He approached Caleb with his whip already unfurled, boots crunching through the dry earth between tobacco rows, and several slaves later reported that they could feel the tension in the air change, as if a storm was gathering despite the cloudless sky. Brennan ordered Caleb to return to work immediately, to leave Moses where he lay, and when Caleb quietly explained that the old man would die without water and shade, Brennan swung his whip in a vicious arc designed to cut through clothing and skin alike. What happened next was described differently by every witness, but all agreed on the essential facts. Caleb's hand moved faster than seemed possible for a man his size, catching the whip in mid-flight, his fingers wrapping around the leather braiding with such force that Brennan felt the vibration travel up his arm. For perhaps 3 seconds, overseer and slave stood frozen in a tableau that represented years of accumulated cruelty meeting years of accumulated restraint, and then Caleb pulled on the whip with just enough force to jerk Brennan off balance. The overseer stumbled forward, rage and shock battling for dominance on his face, and Caleb released the whip and took 1 step backward, his eyes meeting Brennan's for the first time in 8 years of studied subservience. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in the power dynamic that had governed Caleb's entire existence, and everyone watching knew that blood would follow. Brennan reached for the pistol he kept tucked in his belt, a single-shot percussion model that he had used twice before to kill slaves who had dared to fight back, but Caleb moved with a speed that seemed to defy his massive frame. One hand clamped around Brennan's wrist with crushing force, stopping the weapon before it cleared leather, while the other hand landed on the overseer's chest in what looked like a simple push, but sent Brennan flying backward a full 8 feet to land hard in the dirt. The pistol fell free, and Caleb picked it up with the same casual ease that another man might pick up a dropped handkerchief, examining it for a moment before throwing it with tremendous force toward the distant tree line, where it disappeared into the forest surrounding the plantation fields. The other slaves had stopped working entirely now, dozens of witnesses to an act that could only end in death, and Caleb looked at each of them in turn, his expression conveying something that later they would struggle to articulate. It was not triumph or rage or even satisfaction, but rather a kind of profound weariness mixed with sudden clarity, as if he had finally answered a question he had been asking himself for his entire life. Brennan was shouting now, calling for help, scrambling to his feet with murder in his eyes, and Caleb turned without a word and began walking toward the edge of the field with long, steady strides that covered ground far faster than a running man. Two other overseers emerged from different parts of the plantation within minutes, both armed, both responding to Brennan's shouts with the trained efficiency of men who had dealt with runaway slaves before. They fired their weapons at Caleb's retreating form, but he was already 200 yards away and moving through terrain he had studied for 8 years, every dip and rise and patch of cover memorized during endless days of labor. The bullets went wide, and by the time the overseers reached the tree line, Caleb Thornton had vanished into the Kentucky wilderness as completely as if he had never existed. William Blackwood himself arrived on horseback 15 minutes later, his face flushed with exertion and fury as he surveyed the disrupted fields and listened to multiple conflicting accounts of what had transpired. He was a practical man who understood that losing $1,500 worth of property required immediate and decisive action, and within an hour he had dispatched riders to neighboring plantations and the county sheriff with descriptions of his escaped slave and promises of a substantial reward. The initial bounty Blackwood posted was $100 for Caleb's return, alive and relatively undamaged, a sum that represented nearly a year's wages for a working man and immediately attracted attention from professional slave catchers throughout the region. By the next morning, descriptions of the 7-foot giant, as people were already calling him, had spread through a network of plantations, county offices, and taverns that specialized in the business of human hunting. The descriptions emphasized his impossible height, his tremendous strength, and the unusual fact that he had not killed anyone during his escape, details that made some bounty hunters cautious and others eager to add such a notable capture to their reputations. Henry Caldwell heard about Caleb Thornton 3 days after the escape, in a Louisville tavern where slave catchers gathered to exchange information and boast about their successes. Caldwell was 42 years old, a former ranger who had spent a decade tracking criminals and hostile natives through terrain that would have killed softer men, and he had turned to slave catching 5 years earlier when he discovered it paid better than law enforcement and required less paperwork. He was methodical, patient, and brutally effective, with a record of successful captures that made plantation owners seek his services specifically. When he heard the details of Caleb's escape, his first reaction was skepticism, because he had learned that slaves who gained reputations as giants or demons were usually just desperate men who got lucky once. But the facts kept accumulating in ways that piqued his professional interest. The clean escape despite multiple armed overseers, the reports of impossible strength, the complete absence of trail or sign in country that should have shown clear tracks. Caldwell decided to visit the Blackwood plantation personally, riding out on a humid morning when the sky pressed down like a wet blanket and the air itself seemed too thick to breathe. William Blackwood received him in a study lined with ledgers documenting every penny earned and spent in the operation of his 400 acres, and the plantation owner's frustration was evident in every word as he recounted the escape and the complete failure of local trackers to find any trace of his property. Caldwell listened without interrupting, noting details that Blackwood probably considered irrelevant, the way other slaves described Caleb as quiet and withdrawn, the fact that he had shown no signs of planning or preparation before his spontaneous decision to resist, the curious detail that he had helped an old man moments before destroying his own life. After the meeting, Caldwell walked the fields where the confrontation had occurred, examining ground that had been trampled by dozens of feet, but still yielded information to someone who knew how to read disturbed earth. He found the spot where Brennan had fallen, the scuff marks where Caleb had turned and begun his flight, and the point where the fugitive had entered the tree line at a specific angle that suggested either intimate knowledge of the terrain or remarkable intuition. Following the path into the forest, Caldwell discovered something that made him stop and reassess everything he thought he knew about this case. The tracks were there, clear and deep enough that any competent tracker should have followed them easily, but they stopped abruptly after about 300 yards, ending at a spot where the undergrowth showed no signs of disturbance and the ground revealed nothing about which direction Caleb had chosen. Caldwell spent the next 2 hours searching in widening circles, looking for the point where Caleb's trail resumed, and found nothing. It was as if the fugitive had simply stepped into the air and vanished, a feat that violated everything Caldwell knew about tracking and terrain and the limitations of human movement. He returned to the plantation as afternoon shadows lengthened, sought out the slave quarters, and spent the evening talking to people who had known Caleb Thornton during his 8 years at Blackwood. What emerged from these conversations was a portrait of a man who spoke rarely, worked constantly, and displayed a kind of watchful intelligence that made some of the older slaves nervous. One woman, a cook named Ruth who had been at Blackwood longer than anyone else, told Caldwell that Caleb reminded her of her grandfather, a man who had been born free in Africa and never truly accepted his enslavement, who had learned patience as a survival skill but never lost the part of himself that belonged to open horizons and self-determination. Armed with this information, Caldwell returned to Louisville and began assembling a team of men who could help him solve what he now recognized as an unusual problem. Most runaway slaves were caught within days because they ran blindly, following rivers or roads that were easy to patrol, making mistakes born of panic and inexperience with the wider world beyond their plantations. Caleb Thornton, despite his lack of formal education or training, was clearly playing a different game entirely. He was not running blindly, but moving with purpose through territory he understood, and his ability to simply vanish suggested either a level of woodcraft that took most men years to develop or an unusual way of thinking about pursuit and evasion. By mid-September, Caldwell had recruited 20 experienced slave catchers, each bringing specific skills to the hunt. There were trackers who could follow sign over solid rock, former soldiers who understood how to coordinate searches across large areas, and local men who knew every settlement and hiding place within 100 miles. The group established a base of operations at a tavern in Brandenburg, Kentucky, strategically positioned between the Blackwood plantation and the Ohio River, which represented the boundary between slave territory and the nominal freedom of the North. Caldwell's strategy was to flood the region with searchers, cutting off obvious escape routes while systematically checking every possible hiding spot, building a net that would eventually catch Caleb no matter how clever or careful he tried to be. The first credible sighting came 3 weeks after the escape, when a farmer named Peterson reported seeing an enormous Negro walking along a rarely used trail near Irvington, moving north with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Peterson had not attempted to stop or challenge the figure, being unarmed and alone, but he had noted enough details to convince Caldwell that this was indeed their quarry. The lead sent 15 men on a forced march to Irvington, arriving just after dawn to begin a systematic search of the surrounding countryside. They found tracks matching Caleb's unusual size, interviewed locals who confirmed seeing a giant Negro passing through the area, and spent 4 days combing forests and checking barns and questioning anyone who might have offered aid to a fugitive slave. The trail led them north toward Cloverport, then seemed to double back south toward Leachfield, then disappeared entirely somewhere near the Green River. Caldwell studied maps late into the night, trying to understand the logic behind Caleb's movements, and gradually a pattern emerged that was almost taunting in its simplicity. The fugitive was not making a straight run for Ohio, as nearly every escaping slave attempted, but instead was moving in wide, seemingly random circles through central Kentucky, appearing in one location only to vanish and resurface 40 miles away in a completely different direction. It was as if he understood that pursuers expected logical, goal-oriented flight and had decided instead to embrace chaos as a survival strategy. More disturbing was the accumulation of reports about Caleb's actions during these appearances. He did not steal food or supplies as most fugitives were forced to do, but instead seemed to live off the land with remarkable efficiency. Several witnesses reported seeing him near streams at dawn, motionless as a statue, only to learn later that he had been fishing with his bare hands. A traveling preacher claimed to have watched him from a distance, observing as he constructed a serviceable shelter from branches and leaves in less than 20 minutes, work that would have taken most men several hours. By October, word of the hunt had spread far beyond Kentucky, and bounty hunters began arriving from Tennessee, Virginia, and Indiana, drawn by the growing reward and the challenge of catching a fugitive who seemed to be making fools of experienced trackers. William Blackwood, increasingly desperate to recover his valuable property and restore his reputation, had raised the bounty to $300, a sum that represented genuine wealth and attracted men who would ordinarily never consider slave catching as a profession. Caldwell found himself coordinating a growing force that numbered over 80 men by mid-October, a small army dedicated to the capture of a single fugitive slave who had committed no crime beyond the fundamental act of claiming ownership of his own body. The coordination required to manage so many searchers was immense, and Caldwell established a system of regular meetings where information could be shared and strategies debated. These gatherings took on a strange atmosphere as the weeks passed without success, with men who prided themselves on their tracking skills and knowledge of wilderness survival forced to admit that Caleb Thornton was outmaneuvering them at every turn. Some began to attribute supernatural qualities to their quarry, suggesting that no normal man could vanish so completely or move so far so quickly. Others proposed more rational explanations, including the possibility that Caleb had help from sympathizers along the Underground Railroad network that moved escaping slaves toward freedom. Caldwell dismissed both theories, believing instead that they were hunting someone with natural gifts that bordered on the extraordinary, combined with a desperate motivation that sharpened every faculty to an edge that cut through normal limitations. The first direct confrontation came in early November, when 6 bounty hunters cornered Caleb in a barn outside of Munfordville, acting on information from a farmer who had noticed that hay bales had been rearranged to form a hidden sleeping space. The hunters surrounded the barn at dawn, believing they had finally achieved the element of surprise that would end the longest chase any of them had ever experienced. Their leader, a man named Decker who had caught 40 runaway slaves over the past decade, called out for Caleb to surrender, promising that he would not be harmed if he came out peacefully. The response was silence, and after waiting 10 minutes, Decker decided to send 2 men inside while the others covered all possible exits. What happened in the next 5 minutes became the stuff of immediate legend among the bounty hunting community. The 2 men who entered the barn found Caleb waiting for them, standing in the dim interior light with his massive frame making him look more like a monument than a man. Neither hunter had time to properly aim their weapons before Caleb moved, crossing the distance between them in 3 huge strides, disarming the first man by simply ripping the rifle from his grip with enough force to splinter the stock, then lifting him entirely off the ground and throwing him backward into his companion. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs, and Caleb turned toward the rear of the barn where a weak point in the wall boarding offered an exit that the hunters had not properly covered. Outside, Decker and his remaining men heard the commotion and rushed toward the barn's main entrance, arriving just in time to see Caleb burst through the rear wall in an explosion of splintered wood and dust. He emerged into the gray dawn light moving at a speed that seemed impossible for someone his size, and while the hunters scrambled to reposition themselves, he had already covered half the distance to the tree line that marked the edge of cleared farmland. Decker fired twice, both shots going wide, and the other hunters joined in with a ragged volley that accomplished nothing except to fill the morning air with gun smoke and noise. Caleb reached the forest and disappeared into the dense undergrowth, and despite an immediate pursuit that lasted until afternoon, the hunters found themselves once again studying ground that revealed nothing useful, following a trail that seemed to evaporate like morning fog under the sun. The failed capture at Munfordville represented a turning point in the hunt, because it demonstrated to everyone involved that catching Caleb Thornton would require more than luck or even competence. The 2 men he had thrown had suffered broken bones and would carry the memory of that casual display of strength for the rest of their lives. More importantly, the encounter revealed that Caleb had been aware of the hunters' approach long before they believed possible, suggesting senses that operated at a level beyond normal human perception. Decker, humiliated by the escape and nursing bruised ribs from his own fall during the chaos, told anyone who would listen that they were not hunting a man, but rather something that merely looked like a man, a creature that combined human intelligence with physical capabilities that defied natural law. Caldwell absorbed these reports without letting supernatural speculation distract him from practical analysis. But privately, he was beginning to understand that they were indeed dealing with someone exceptional. The combination of physical prowess, wilderness skill, and apparent tactical intelligence suggested that Caleb Thornton would have made a formidable soldier or scout if circumstances had given him the opportunity for such a life. Instead, Those same gifts were being turned toward the simple goal of remaining free, and the result was a chase that was beginning to take on mythic proportions throughout the region. Stories about the 7-foot giant circulated in slave quarters and plantation houses alike, with each retelling adding new embellishments to the documented facts. Some said he could jump across rivers that would require a bridge for normal men. Others claimed he had been seen in 3 different counties on the same day, as if he could move across distances that should require days of travel. A few whispered that he was a spirit of vengeance sent to punish those who traded in human flesh, an idea that terrified overseers and amused abolitionists in equal measure. By late November, the hunt had expanded to include over 120 men, making it the largest manhunt for a fugitive slave in Kentucky history. The group included professional slave catchers from 5 states, local farmers hoping to claim the reward, former soldiers looking for adventure, and even a few men who seemed motivated more by the challenge than by any hope of financial gain. Caldwell had effectively become the general of a volunteer army, coordinating searches across hundreds of square miles, establishing a network of informants and watchers, and trying to maintain discipline among men who were increasingly frustrated by their continued failure to catch a single unarmed fugitive. The winter months brought new challenges to both hunter and hunted, as November turned to December and temperatures dropped to levels that could kill an unprepared man in a single night. Snow began to fall in early December, covering the ground and creating conditions that should have made tracking trivially easy, yet somehow Caleb continued to evade capture. The hunt shifted strategy, focusing on the reality that even someone with Caleb's apparent abilities would need shelter during the coldest months, and teams began checking every cave, abandoned building, and protected hollow within the search area. They found evidence of temporary camps, places where someone had clearly spent a night or two before moving on, but they never managed to close the distance between discovery and capture. A significant breakthrough came in mid-December, when a storekeeper in Glendale reported that a huge Negro had appeared at his back door just before dawn, offering to split firewood in exchange for food. The storekeeper, a pragmatic man named Williams who cared more about getting his winter wood supply organized than about maintaining racial hierarchies, had agreed to the exchange and spent several hours watching Caleb work. Williams later told investigators that he had never seen anything like the display of power and efficiency he witnessed that morning, as Caleb reduced a massive pile of logs to neatly split firewood using an axe that seemed like a toy in his enormous hands. The 2 men had not spoken beyond the initial transaction, but Williams reported that Caleb had worked with a kind of focused intensity that suggested he found something meditative or calming in the physical labor. When Caldwell's team arrived in Glendale 6 hours later, following up on a tip from Williams' neighbor who had seen the giant Negro and reported him to local authorities, they once again found themselves studying a cold trail that revealed little about which direction Caleb had chosen. But Williams provided one detail that Caldwell found genuinely useful. Before leaving, Caleb had asked if the storekeeper knew of any places where a man could find honest work without questions, and Williams had mentioned that lumber camps in Indiana often hired workers without looking too closely at their backgrounds, especially during the winter months when they needed extra hands to meet spring deadlines. The information suggested that Caleb was not simply running blindly, but was actively looking for a way to establish a new life beyond the reach of his pursuers, a goal that required him to cross into Indiana and somehow blend into communities where a 7-foot Negro would be instantly memorable. The hunt shifted focus to the Ohio River crossing points, based on the theory that Caleb would eventually need to attempt the dangerous winter passage into Indiana. Caldwell positioned teams at every ferry landing and shallow ford along a 100-mile stretch of river, creating a surveillance network that should have made crossing impossible without detection. The river itself was partially frozen by late December, with ice forming along the banks and in the slower sections, creating conditions that made any crossing attempt extremely hazardous. Most of Caldwell's men believed that Caleb would be forced to wait for spring thaw, giving them months to tighten the net and eventually force a confrontation that would end the chase. On Christmas Eve, with temperatures hovering just above freezing and a steady rain, making conditions miserable for the men stationed along the river, a farmer on the Indiana side reported seeing an enormous figure emerge from the Ohio River near Cannelton, water streaming from his body despite the freezing conditions, moving inland with the steady purpose of someone who had just completed a difficult but successful journey. The farmer had watched from a distance, too shocked to raise an alarm immediately, and by the time he reached the nearest town to report what he had seen, Caleb Thornton had once again vanished into terrain that offered 1,000 hiding places for someone willing to endure hardship. The crossing represented both a triumph and a crisis for the fugitive, because while he had successfully reached nominally free territory, he was now operating in Indiana, where the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 gave slave catchers legal authority to pursue and capture escaped slaves even in non-slave states. More importantly, the sheer number of bounty hunters now involved in the chase meant that information about his appearance and movements would spread quickly through Indiana communities, making it difficult for him to move openly or seek the kind of employment that Williams had suggested might be available. Caldwell crossed into Indiana 2 days after Christmas, bringing 30 of his most experienced men and armed with warrants that gave them authority to search properties and detain suspects throughout the state. The legal situation was complex, because while Indiana law technically prohibited slavery, it also required authorities to cooperate with slave catchers pursuing fugitives from other states, creating a patchwork of jurisdictions where Caleb might find temporary sanctuary or deadly betrayal, depending on the political leanings of local officials. The hunt through Indiana took on a different character than the Kentucky phase, because here they could not simply patrol wilderness areas, but had to search towns and settlements where Caleb might be hiding among free Negro communities that existed throughout the state. January of 1854 brought brutal cold to the region, with temperatures dropping below zero for days at a time and snow accumulating to depths that made travel difficult even on established roads. Under these conditions, the hunt necessarily slowed, but it did not stop entirely. Small teams of determined bounty hunters continued to search, following up on reported sightings that came with increasing frequency now that Caleb was moving through more populated areas. There were reports from Corydon, from Salem, from Brownstown, each describing a giant Negro who appeared briefly before vanishing again, leaving behind only the memory of his impossible size and the growing legend of his invincibility. The most detailed encounter came in early February, when a logging camp near Powley hired a huge Negro who gave his name as John Freeman and claimed to be a free man from Ohio looking for winter work. The camp foreman, desperate for experienced hands and not particularly concerned about verifying the background of someone who could clearly do the work, put the new arrival to immediate use hauling logs that normally required teams of men. For 3 weeks, the man who called himself John Freeman worked alongside other loggers, demonstrating strength that became the subject of odd conversation around evening campfires. He could carry logs that took 4 normal men to lift, could work for hours without apparent fatigue, and possessed a kind of quiet competence that earned respect even from men who might otherwise have been hostile to a Negro working among them. The arrangement ended when a bounty hunter named Crawford, following up on a tip from a suspicious local who thought the new logger matched descriptions of the 7-foot giant, arrived at the camp asking questions about recent hires. The foreman initially refused to cooperate, valuing his productive worker more than he cared about helping slave catchers, but Crawford had brought a warrant and 5 armed men, making cooperation the only practical option. They found Caleb's living quarters, a simple shelter he had constructed in the woods near the main camp, and surrounded it just after dawn when most men were still asleep after a night of heavy snow. The confrontation that followed became one of the most widely reported incidents in the entire saga of the 7-foot giant's flight. Crawford called for Caleb to emerge and surrender, and after a long silence, the fugitive appeared in the doorway of his shelter, fully dressed despite the early hour, as if he had been expecting this moment. Crawford later described feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold when he looked into Caleb's eyes and saw not fear or resignation, but a kind of calm calculation that suggested the cornered man was several steps ahead in planning his next move. The bounty hunter repeated his demand for surrender, and Caleb responded with the first words he had spoken directly to his pursuers since the hunt began, asking simply if Crawford would kill an unarmed man who posed no threat to anyone. The question hung in the frozen air between them, and Crawford found himself unable to answer immediately, because the honest reply was that yes, He would kill Caleb if necessary to claim the reward, but saying so out loud seemed to strip away all the legal and social justifications that made slave catching a profession rather than simply kidnapping. Before the conversation could continue, Caleb moved with the explosive speed that had become his trademark, not toward his pursuers but away from them, launching himself toward the densest section of surrounding forest in a sprint that covered ground faster than seemed possible for a man his size. Crawford and his men fired wildly, panic and surprise spoiling their aim, and while at least one bullet struck close enough that Caleb's jacket showed a torn section where the round passed through fabric without touching flesh, none of the shots slowed his flight. The chase through the winter forest lasted for 3 hours, with Crawford's team following tracks that were obvious in the fresh snow, but somehow always staying just far enough behind that they never caught sight of their quarry. Eventually, the tracks led to a partially frozen creek, and there they stopped as completely as if Caleb had simply ceased to exist. Crawford spent the rest of the day searching both banks of the creek for where the trail resumed, but the frozen ground and snow-covered landscape revealed nothing. It was as if Caleb had walked into the creek and then ascended into the sky, leaving behind nothing but questions and frustration. By March, the hunt was beginning to fracture as men who had spent months pursuing the 7-foot giant without success started to drift away to other opportunities. The reward money remained unclaimed, and while William Blackwood had raised the bounty to $500 in a desperate attempt to maintain interest, many of the original hunters were beginning to believe that Caleb Thornton was simply uncatchable by normal means. Some attributed this to divine protection, suggesting that God favored the cause of a man seeking freedom over those who would return him to bondage. Others maintained more practical explanations, arguing that Caleb had clearly received help from Underground Railroad operatives who moved him between safe houses and provided resources that explained his ability to survive months of pursuit through hostile territory. Caldwell himself was beginning to reassess his involvement in the hunt, not from any moral qualms about slave catching, but from a growing professional respect for a quarry who had demonstrated skills that rivaled or exceeded his own. In his private journal, which would be discovered decades later by historians researching this period, he wrote that pursuing Caleb Thornton had taught him humility and forced him to question assumptions he had held about the capabilities of slaves and the nature of human potential. He described Caleb not as property to be recovered, but as an adversary worthy of admiration. Someone who had transformed the simple act of running away into an art form that combined physical prowess, tactical thinking, and an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and anticipate pursuit. The spring of 1854 brought new challenges to the hunt, as warming temperatures turned winter snow to mud that made tracking difficult and opened up countless hiding places that had been inaccessible during the frozen months. Sightings of the 7-foot giant became less frequent, with weeks passing between credible reports, and the character of these sightings began to change in ways that suggested Caleb was adapting his strategy yet again. Instead of appearing in logging camps or near settlements where his size made him instantly memorable, he seemed to have retreated to the most remote wilderness areas of southern Indiana, places where even experienced woodsmen rarely traveled. Several hunters who ventured into these areas returned with stories of feeling watched, of hearing movement in the forest that they could never quite locate, of finding campsites that appeared to have been abandoned only hours before their arrival. By May, the organized hunt had effectively ended, with Caldwell disbanding his core team and returning to other work, acknowledging that they had been beaten by a superior opponent who had simply outlasted their resources and determination. Of the 120 men who had at various points participated in the pursuit of Caleb Thornton, fewer than 20 remained actively searching by late spring, and even these diehards were operating more from stubborn pride than from any realistic hope of success. The legend of the 7-foot giant had grown far beyond the facts of his escape, spreading through slave communities across the South as a story of hope and resistance, while simultaneously becoming a cautionary tale among slave catchers about the dangers of underestimating any fugitive based on assumptions about race or education. The final confirmed sighting of Caleb Thornton came in June of 1854, when a circuit-riding preacher named Josiah Reed reported encountering a massive Negro in a remote valley near the Ohio border. Reed had been traveling between small settlements, bringing religious services to families too isolated to have regular access to churches, and he had made camp one evening in a clearing beside a small stream. As twilight deepened into darkness, he became aware of a presence at the edge of his firelight, and looking up he saw the largest man he had ever encountered, standing motionless in the shadows as if deciding whether to approach or fade back into the forest. Reed later wrote a detailed account of this meeting, describing how he invited the stranger to share his fire and meal, and how after a long hesitation the giant Negro accepted the offer, moving into the light with a grace that seemed almost impossible given his size. The two men sat in silence for several minutes before Reed spoke, asking if the stranger was the escaped slave known as the 7-foot giant that everyone in the region had heard about. Caleb, for the preacher had no doubt about the identity of his guest, did not answer directly, but instead asked if Reed intended to report his presence to authorities or bounty hunters. The preacher replied that he believed all men were equal in the eyes of God, and that he would never betray someone seeking freedom to those who would return him to bondage. What followed was a conversation that lasted deep into the night, with Caleb speaking more words than he had probably spoken to any white man in his entire life. He talked about his childhood in Virginia, sold away from his mother when he was barely 8 years old, about the succession of plantations where his unusual size made him valuable property, but also a target for overseers who saw his strength as a challenge to their authority. He described the moment when he caught Brennan's whip and felt something fundamental change inside him, a realization that he could no longer live in the cage of slavery, even if it meant dying in the attempt to escape. He spoke about the long months of pursuit, the constant vigilance required to stay ahead of hunters who never stopped searching, the loneliness of a life lived always on the edge of capture or death. Reed asked what Caleb planned to do, whether he intended to try reaching Canada where he would be truly beyond the reach of the Fugitive Slave Act, or if he planned to remain hidden in the Indiana wilderness indefinitely. Caleb's answer revealed the depth of thought he had given to his situation. He explained that he had realized during the winter that simply running would never be enough, that as long as he remained in the United States, he would always be hunted property rather than a free man. But he also understood that reaching Canada required resources and connections he did not possess, and that attempting the journey would likely result in his capture or death. Instead, he had decided to become a ghost, to live so far from civilization and move so carefully that he would fade from memory, becoming nothing more than a legend that people told but no longer actively pursued. The preacher tried to persuade Caleb to let him help arrange passage north through Underground Railroad contacts, but the fugitive declined with what Reed described as a sad smile. He explained that he had learned during his months of flight that he was most free when he was most alone, that depending on others, even sympathetic others, was just another form of captivity. He thanked Reed for the conversation and the meal, then stood and moved back toward the darkness at the edge of the firelight. Before disappearing entirely, he turned and said something that the preacher would remember for the rest of his life, that the bounty hunters had failed to catch him not because he was faster or stronger or smarter than them, but because they could never understand that a man who has nothing to lose and everything to gain will always defeat men who are merely doing a job. After that night, there were no more confirmed sightings of Caleb Thornton, though rumors and supposed encounters would continue for years. Some claimed to have seen a giant Negro living among the Cherokee in the Western Territories. Others insisted he had made his way to Mexico, where he lived under a new name. Still others believed he had died during his flight, and his body lay undiscovered in some remote wilderness area. The truth was that Caleb had achieved exactly what he set out to do, transforming himself from a piece of property with a name and a price into a legend without a location or an ending. The impact of his escape extended far beyond his personal story, influencing how slave catchers approached their work and how slaves thought about the possibility of resistance. William Blackwood never recovered the financial loss of losing his most valuable property, and the failure to capture Caleb damaged his reputation among other plantation owners who questioned how one man could lose control of his holdings so completely. Marcus Brennan, the overseer whose brutality had triggered the initial escape, became increasingly violent in his treatment of remaining slaves, as if trying to prevent any other rebellions through pure intimidation, and he would eventually be found dead in his quarters 3 years later in circumstances that suggested several slaves had cooperated in his murder. Henry Caldwell, the professional tracker who had led the largest portion of the hunt, wrote in his journal that the pursuit of Caleb Thornton had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. He had begun the hunt viewing his quarry as simply another runaway slave, valuable property to be recovered and returned to its rightful owner. He ended it with the uncomfortable recognition that he had been trying to recapture someone who had more claim to personhood and dignity than many of the men who were legally considered free and equal citizens. Caldwell would continue working as a slave catcher for 2 more years before abandoning the profession entirely, moving west to territories where his tracking skills could be used to guide settlers rather than to hunt human beings. The story of the 7-foot giant spread throughout the slave-holding states, told and retold in slave quarters with embellishments that transformed Caleb from an escaped slave into a figure of almost supernatural resistance. Parents told their children about the giant who could break chains with his bare hands, who could outrun horses, who could disappear into thin air when cornered by armed men. The details changed with each telling, but the core message remained constant, that even in a system designed to crush individual will and break human spirits, there existed the possibility of successful resistance for those willing to risk everything. Among abolitionists in the North, Caleb's story became evidence of the fundamental humanity of slaves and the injustice of a system that treated human beings as property. Frederick Douglass, the famous escaped slave and abolitionist speaker, referenced the 7-foot giant in several speeches, using his story to argue that the same qualities, strength, intelligence, resourcefulness, that made Caleb valuable as a slave also proved that he deserved freedom and respect as a human being. The fact that he had evaded capture by over 100 armed men for nearly a year demonstrated capabilities that many white Americans preferred to believe Negroes did not possess, forcing uncomfortable questions about the entire foundation of slavery as an institution. In the decades that followed, historians and researchers would attempt to trace what actually happened to Caleb Thornton after his disappearance, examining records and conducting interviews with people who lived in the regions where he was last seen. Some claim to have evidence that he reached Canada and lived there under an assumed name until his death in 1892, but these claims were never definitively proven. Others believed he remained in the remote wilderness areas of southern Indiana for years, living a solitary existence that allowed him to maintain his freedom while avoiding the risks of attempting to integrate into any settled community. A few researchers proposed that he died during his flight, succumbing to disease or injury or exposure in the months immediately following his escape, and that all subsequent sightings were either misidentifications or deliberate hoaxes. The most detailed research was conducted in the 1920s by a historian named Margaret Whitfield, who spent 5 years tracking down every piece of documentary evidence related to the hunt for the 7-foot giant and interviewing elderly descendants of people who had known Caleb or participated in his pursuit. Whitfield's conclusion was that Caleb had indeed survived his flight and had lived for at least another decade in remote areas of Indiana and possibly Illinois, supporting himself through occasional work at lumber camps and mines where his strength was valued and his past was not questioned. She based this conclusion on multiple independent accounts from people who claimed to have employed or encountered a giant Negro who matched Caleb's description during the 1850s and early 1860s, combined with the complete absence of any records indicating that he was ever captured or killed. Whitfield also documented how the story of the 7-foot giant influenced the development of African American folklore and oral tradition, becoming a touchstone narrative that embodied themes of resistance, survival, and the possibility of successful escape from oppression. She found versions of the story being told in slave communities across the South, with each region adding local details and variations, but maintaining the core elements of a giant slave who defied capture through a combination of strength, intelligence, and determination. The story had evolved into something larger than the historical facts, becoming a myth that served important social and psychological functions for people living under the constant threat of violence and degradation. The hunters who participated in the pursuit of Caleb Thornton carried their own memories and lessons from that year of fruitless searching. Some became more brutal in their treatment of fugitive slaves they subsequently captured, as if trying to compensate for the humiliation of their failure. Others left the profession entirely, unwilling to continue work that had revealed uncomfortable truths about the humanity of people they had been taught to view as property. A few became actively sympathetic to abolitionist causes, their experiences during the hunt converting them from slave catchers to opponents of the entire system they had once served. The financial cost of the hunt was substantial, with various bounty hunters and their sponsors spending thousands of dollars on supplies, travel, and lost wages during the months they pursued Caleb without success. William Blackwood's initial bounty of $100 had grown to $500 by the time the organized hunt collapsed, and even at that increased amount the reward went unclaimed. Some plantation owners began to question whether the cost of pursuing escaped slaves always made economic sense, especially when dealing with someone as resourceful as Caleb had proven to be. This pragmatic calculation never translated into moral opposition to slavery itself, but it did influence how some owners approached the management of their property and the decision-making process when slaves escaped. In the immediate aftermath of Caleb's successful evasion, there was a brief but noticeable increase in escape attempts by slaves throughout Kentucky and the surrounding states, as if his example had inspired others to risk the dangers of flight. Most of these attempts ended in recapture or death, because few fugitives possessed Caleb's unique combination of physical gifts and wilderness skills. But the fact that the attempts increased at all suggested that his story had punctured the myth of inevitable capture that helped maintain the psychological control necessary to keep millions of people in bondage. Plantation owners and overseers responded with increased vigilance and harsher punishments for those caught attempting escape, trying to restore the deterrent effect that Caleb's success had temporarily undermined. The legend of the 7-foot giant would persist through the Civil War and into the Reconstruction era, with various claimed sightings and supposed encounters continuing to circulate through African American communities. During the war itself, some Union soldiers reported meeting an enormous Negro working as a laborer or guide who matched descriptions of Caleb Thornton, but none of these accounts were verified, and most historians believe they were cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. The power of the legend was such that people wanted to believe Caleb was still out there somewhere, still free, still defying the system that had tried to reduce him to property. By the turn of the 20th century, as slavery receded into history and new generations grew up without direct experience of that institution, the story of the 7-foot giant underwent another transformation. It became less a historical account and more a folk tale, joining the tradition of tall tales and legendary figures that populated American storytelling. Some versions gave Caleb magical powers, claiming he could fly or become invisible or communicate with animals. These embellishments obscured the historical reality of a real man who accomplished extraordinary things through natural gifts and determination, but they also ensured that the story would continue to be told and remembered. The psychological impact of Caleb's escape on the institution of slavery itself is difficult to measure, but was likely significant in subtle ways. Every slave who heard about the 7-foot giant and his successful evasion of 120 bounty hunters learned that the power of slave owners and catchers was not absolute, that the system could be defied and defeated by someone with enough courage and skill. This knowledge existed alongside the brutal reality that most escape attempts failed, and that recaptured fugitives faced horrific punishments designed to discourage others from trying. But the mere existence of successful escapes like Caleb's introduced an element of doubt into a system that depended on the appearance of total control. For the bounty hunters and slave catchers who participated in the pursuit, the memory of their failure became a kind of professional embarrassment that most preferred not to discuss. Men who had built reputations on their ability to track and capture fugitive slaves found those reputations tarnished by their association with the hunt for the 7-foot giant. Some tried to minimize their involvement or claimed that they had nearly captured Caleb on several occasions, inventing stories that portrayed them in more favorable lights than the reality of their repeated failures. Others acknowledged their defeat but attributed it to supernatural or impossible factors, suggesting that Caleb had received help from sources beyond normal human assistance. Henry Caldwell's private journals, discovered and published in 1947, provided the most honest and detailed account of the hunt from the perspective of those who pursued Caleb. Caldwell's writing revealed a complex psychological journey, as he gradually moved from viewing his quarry as valuable property to recognizing him as a worthy opponent to finally acknowledging him as a human being whose desire for freedom was as legitimate as Caldwell's own desire for reputation and reward. The journals did not reveal a sudden moral awakening or conversion to abolitionism, but rather a slow accumulation of respect and recognition that eventually made Caldwell question the entire enterprise of slave catching. The final entry in Caldwell's journals related to the hunt was dated August of 1854, nearly a year after Caleb's initial escape. Caldwell wrote that he had officially abandoned the pursuit and closed his involvement in the case, acknowledging that they had been beaten by someone who simply wanted freedom more than the hunters wanted the reward. He noted that in all his years of tracking, he had never encountered anyone who combined Caleb's physical capabilities with his apparent intelligence and tactical sense, and he concluded that such a person should never have been enslaved in the first place. The entry ended with a question that Caldwell left unanswered, asking himself what kind of society creates institutions that require men to hunt other men, and whether participating in such institutions damages something essential in the human spirit. The broader historical significance of the 7-foot giant case lies not in the details of one man's escape, but in what it revealed about the tensions and contradictions inherent in American slavery. The institution depended on maintaining the fiction that enslaved people were property rather than persons, that they lacked the capabilities and qualities that defined full humanity, that they required and benefited from the control imposed by their owners. Caleb Thornton's successful resistance to capture by a force of 120 armed men completely demolished these fictions, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded those of most free men regardless of race. The fact that his story spread so widely and inspired so much commentary from both defenders and opponents of slavery indicated that his escape had touched a nerve in the national conversation about the institution. Abolitionist speakers and writers seized on the story as evidence of their arguments about the fundamental humanity and capabilities of African Americans. If an uneducated slave could outwit and outmaneuver professional trackers and hunters, demonstrating intelligence, planning ability, physical prowess, and tactical sense, then clearly the claimed justifications for slavery based on racial inferiority were false. The story became a set piece in abolitionist lectures and pamphlets, usually embellished with additional details that made Caleb even more impressive and his pursuers even more incompetent, but grounded in facts that even slavery's defenders could not entirely dismiss. Those who supported slavery responded to the story in various ways, but most attempted to downplay its significance or attribute Caleb's success to factors other than his own capabilities. Some claimed he had received extensive help from Underground Railroad operatives, making his escape a product of organized assistance rather than individual ability. Others suggested that the bounty hunters had been incompetent or lazy, failing through their own inadequacies rather than being defeated by a superior opponent. Still others resorted to claims of supernatural intervention, suggesting that only divine or diabolic assistance could explain how one Negro had evaded so many experienced white men. None of these explanations were entirely convincing, and the discomfort they revealed suggested that the story of the 7-foot giant had created cognitive dissonance in people whose worldview depended on believing that enslaved people were inherently inferior. The transformation of Caleb Thornton from a real person into a legendary figure was essentially complete by the 1870s, as the generation that had lived through his escape began to die off and direct memories were replaced by increasingly embellished retellings. The process followed patterns common to folk hero creation, where historical facts are preserved in outline, but filled in with details that serve narrative and symbolic purposes rather than strict accuracy. What remained constant across all versions was the core story of an enslaved man who refused to accept his bondage, who used his extraordinary physical gifts and determined spirit to win freedom against overwhelming odds, and who vanished into legend rather than being recaptured or confirmed dead. For African Americans navigating the difficult decades of Reconstruction and Jim Crow that followed the Civil War, the story of the 7-foot giant served as a reminder that resistance to oppression was possible and could be successful. The details of his escape, the way he had outthought and outmaneuvered his pursuers, the completeness of his disappearance into freedom, all provided a narrative template that emphasized agency and capability in a context designed to deny both. Parents told the story to children, preachers referenced it in sermons about perseverance and faith, and community elders kept it alive as part of an oral tradition that preserved memories and lessons that formal history often ignored or minimized. The hunt for the 7-foot giant had lasted approximately 1 year, from August of 1853 to August of 1854, involving at its peak over 120 bounty hunters and slave catchers, representing the largest organized pursuit of a single fugitive slave in the antebellum period. The costs were substantial, both in direct expenses and in the psychological impact on everyone involved. For William Blackwood, the plantation owner who had lost his most valuable property, the failure represented both a financial disaster and a permanent stain on his reputation as someone who could not control his own slaves. For the bounty hunters who participated, the experience ranged from embarrassing failure to profound life-changing encounter with their own assumptions about race and humanity. For other slaves who heard the story, it provided hope and inspiration, proving that the system was not invincible and that freedom was possible for those willing to risk everything to achieve it. In the final analysis, Caleb Thornton's legacy transcends the specific details of his escape and pursuit. His story became part of a larger narrative about resistance to oppression, about the human drive for freedom and self-determination, and about the ways that individuals can challenge and defeat systems designed to control them. Whether he lived out his days in freedom somewhere in the wilderness of the Midwest, or eventually reached Canada, or died alone in some remote location known only to him, the fact remains that he achieved what he set out to do. He escaped slavery, evaded recapture despite unprecedented efforts to find him, and transformed himself from William Blackwood's property into his own person. That transformation, preserved in memory and story, represents a victory that no amount of subsequent embellishment or distortion can diminish. The question of what ultimately happened to Caleb Thornton after that final confirmed sighting in June of 1854 remains unanswered, and at this distance in time will likely never be definitively resolved. But perhaps the uncertainty is itself appropriate, allowing the legend to remain open-ended, keeping alive the possibility that somewhere out there a free man named Caleb lived his life on his own terms, beyond the reach of those who would reduce him to property. In the absence of confirmed capture or death, we are left with the image of the 7-foot giant walking into the wilderness and disappearing into freedom, a conclusion that serves the story's deeper purposes even if historical accuracy remains elusive. What we know with certainty is that for approximately 1 year, over 120 men dedicated substantial time, resources, and effort to the capture of a single escaped slave, and despite every advantage of numbers, weapons, legal authority, and social support, they failed completely. That failure, and the story that grew from it, influenced how generations of Americans thought about slavery, freedom, race, and human capability. Caleb Thornton's escape became more than just one man's bid for freedom. It became a demonstration that the supposedly natural order of slavery was actually a fragile construct maintained by force and fear, and that individuals with courage and determination could shatter that construct and claim the freedom that should have been their birthright. The hunters who chased the 7-foot giant across 3 states disbanded defeated, their reputations damaged, and their confidence shaken by an encounter with someone who proved superior to them in every measure that mattered. Some carried the lessons of that failure into new understandings about human dignity and worth. Others buried their embarrassment under rationalizations and excuses. But none could deny the fundamental reality that they had been beaten by an unarmed, uneducated slave who wanted his freedom more than they wanted the reward for returning him to bondage. That simple truth, preserved in stories told around fires and dinner tables for generations, stands as Caleb Thornton's enduring legacy. A reminder that the human spirit cannot ultimately be owned or controlled, and that freedom, once truly desired, will find a way to manifest regardless of the obstacles placed in its path.